My name's Bernadette, and thank you so much for Annie for having me, and Rosie for inviting me as well. It's great to be here, and I've really enjoyed all the talk so far. And Rebecca, I was really moved by your talk as well. So yes, a little bit of a different twist, I suppose. I'm talking more about my academic research directly, which isn't directly addressed to carer experience, but it is inspired by it. So my talk is Lost Landscapes, Solastalgia in the Lives of Carer Experience Characters and Literature. So I'll explain a little bit more about solastalgia in a couple of slides. But basically the background to the paper. So the paper examines how contemporary literature reflects the emotional impact of disrupted belonging and a changing sense of place for care experience individuals. So in 2019, I was invited to the Care Experience Conference at Hope University in Liverpool. I think maybe a few people here might have been part of that. And I met Rosie Canning there, and we had a little chat sort of in the fringes of the conference, as you do, I think maybe in the book room. And we're talking about how a lot of people are sort of led to their academic research through their own personal experiences. So obviously Rosie's PhD was about finding a fictional home, so it's quite transparent. But my own research has been about climate change and the emotional impact of coming to terms with a changing climate and the impact that has on everybody across the globe. And when I started doing that research, I wasn't really aware of the fact that it was maybe inspired by my own upbringing. So my own personal experiences of place-based distress, i.e. being in care, had led to an interest in this area, but it wasn't something that I'd really realised to begin with. It was only later on that I began to realise this, and it was something I reflected on in the bridging document of my thesis. So my academic research examined the emotional impact of place-based distress, and I completed my PhD on climate and changing emergent emotions in short eco-fiction at the University of Liverpool in 2023. So when I say emergent emotions, what I'm talking about there is that because climate change is something that we're still coming to terms with, we haven't really got the language to describe how we might feel about that. And it's quite interesting because rough estimates for the number of climate refugees by 2050 at the moment vary quite widely, but they're from 44 million to 1.2 billion. If you think back to the Irish famine and how many people were placed into care due to the environmental factors that were part of the potato famine, obviously a lot of people got put into care for like the Christian Brothers and the Catholic Church. My family were impacted by that. So there is some really interesting sort of correlations here. So solastalgia, a few people who are here maybe from Australia might have heard of this because the term was coined by an Australian environmental philosopher called Glenn Albrecht. So he termed this phrase to try and help people understand the psychological trauma, also referred to as place-based distress experience because of environmental change. So really, he was talking about sort of climate change in this context. So he'd been doing some work with Australian farmers, people who'd been suffering severe drought, and they were living on sort of homesteads that might have been the family for hundreds and hundreds of years. But because it had been changed so much, it was no longer recognisable to them. So it's sort of like what they refer to as a homesickness while you're still at home. So sort of a feeling that things aren't quite right. So he sort of brought the word together. Its etymology was from a combination of the Latin words solatium, which is solace or comfort, solus, which means desolation, and the Greek root word algia, which is pain, suffering, or grief. And this is really a nod to the word nostalgia in its very original meaning. So in 1688, a medical student called Johannes Hofer was doing his dissertation, and he came with the word nostalgia. So I think the nos means return to home, and again the algia means pain, suffering. And he was working with groups of, for example, soldiers who he noticed and observed were having like a very difficult time being away from home and became very depressed. So back then, in 1688, they decided that nostalgia was like a disease, and also that a sort of depressed state was leading to like a dampened immune system. So they were getting ill and succumbing to illnesses more. They believed that nostalgia could kill people. So it's really interesting when you think about that and maybe sort of correlate it to works like The Body Keeps the Score by, I always forget his name, Van der Kolk. Yeah, so I think that's a book that's been sort of shared around in the care community, The Body Keeps the Score, which is basically sort of talking about how trauma can inform our health and the diseases and illnesses that we get. So yeah, so there is quite a big crossover here, which is quite interesting. And I've chosen to look at 2 short stories which show signs of both these things. So the first short story I'm going to look at is a short story called Foster by Claire Keegan. So this short story was published in 2010 by The New Yorker. Since then, it's been published in book form, and it's also been adapted into a feature film called The Quiet Girl, which a few of you may have seen. It was out in 2022 and adapted into the Irish language. So I'm just going to read a section from Claire Keegan's original short story when it was published in 2010. So the short story opening, it begins with the journey of a young girl being taken into foster care, which I think a few people might recognise this. So early on a Sunday, after first mass in Connegall, my father, instead of taking me home, drives deep into Wexford towards the coast where my mother's people come from. I wonder what it will be like, this place belonging to the Kinsellas. I see a tall woman standing over me, making me drink milk still hot from the cow. I see another, less likely version of her in an apron. So in this section of the story, it's the opening paragraph of the original story, and the young girl has been taken by her father to go and stay with foster carers. In this case, it's kinship care. So the relatives, but they're not relatives that are known to her. They're not somebody who she's super close to. This could be her first time of meeting them. The story is set in the 1980s when Ireland was going through another quite difficult period, and her family didn't have much money. They were relying on things like farming and sort of business things that you could do in the country, and they were really struggling to feed all their children. And her mother's expecting a new baby, and she's showing signs of being quite difficult. So they decide out of all the children that she should go away and be fostered for the summer, at least, and then they'll decide what to do. In the opening of the film, I'm going to show you a short clip in the next slide. When the camera opens, we can see her hiding in the grass. She doesn't want to be found by her family, so she's got the sense that everything is not good at home and she doesn't feel quite cared about, and she knows that something bad is potentially going to happen. But the interesting thing is the environmental uncertainty applies to both the domestic sphere and also the sort of, the natural environment around her, that her, in the sense that her family are relying on sort of the farming community and farming practices to make a living, and that also impacts on their family life. The dad's pictured as drinking, gambling, having affairs behind her mother's back, and causing a lot of instability in the family. So I'm just going to show you a short video. I'm sure hopefully some of you may have seen this film. I know a couple of people have. Hopefully, let's see if this works. Let's see.
How long should they keep her? Till after the baby?
Sure, can't they keep her as long as they like?
Wel, ich an galing sa. Sias amach, good ára mé splech a ceartart. And she was saying hello to our guest.
That's herself then.
Herself, his name.
She'll head you a house and home.
We'll keep the child gladly.
Mae'n fórsti sa.
Nín sa teach ach mé héna go seo.
Ní féidir le dul I fánéad mar son. An a rion tú mé!
Ná bíocha ach láirt.
Tá sé te.
Rhaid tú da hi Bhfuil tú géirí coit sa bhre leat inniu?
Isn't your mammy good to you?
Colleen Cune and Colleen Cana.
Der siúr méid is gádaí ará.
You're a visitor.
Godfrey.
De mar rud é gur leomsa ní ágin ó riamh I dtí le stráséir.
Seo, look. Den tú sé. Ní gá duit rud ará. Is mí duine nóir thógan de sé bhéalach am dúnta is a chail mór an dá bhá.
Yes, I don't know how many people know about this film, but it's really interesting that it's been based on this short story called Foster by Claire Keegan, especially considering it was published in 2010. It's taken quite a long time. It's obviously come to the eye of Colin Burhead, who was the director for this film. And I think he's had it translated into the Irish language as a bit of kind of reclamation, really. So the storyline follows this young girl who's sort of sent away from her family, and she experiences this kind of kinship care with these distant relatives. But there's some really interesting sort of things throughout the film, which I can't show the whole thing, but there's an instance where her foster mother asks her if her mother's had the hay brought in, which anybody who's got an Irish background knows if you've not had the hay sorted out for the year, then it's a big sign that something's wrong at home. So little references like that really sort of depict and reflect what's going on with the troubles in the sort of domestic sphere. And again, there's a lot of kind of stigma in sort of stereotypical care experience narratives where maybe the sort of lens of the narrator looks at the struggles of maybe the parents, and maybe sometimes, there's a lot of focus on things like addiction, mental health, and those being the things that have caused these children to be taken into care, but it's not often a lens on what's caused those problems, what's caused addiction, what's caused mental health breakdown, and what's caused domestic violence. And obviously a lot of the time this is usually linked to kind of intergenerational trauma, economic hardship that is passed down through the lines, which is something particularly we see like in the Irish literature and instances of children in Ireland being taken into care. I myself am from a long line of Irish families who have been in institutional care. So my mother was born in a mother and baby home, and at the last second, my nan, her sisters helped her break out, so she narrowly avoided being adopted. But my nan, again, most of her siblings were sort of given up into Catholic care in Ireland when she was younger. So these things kind of carry on. I think it's really interesting, but I think we need more narratives that look at what has caused these things in the sort of bigger picture and the wider context. So yeah, I'm just going to go into the next slide. Yes, the next short story I'm going to look at is called Dogs Go Wolf by an American author called Lauren Groff, and she produced a collection called Florida. But basically all her stories are around sort of climate change, but a lot of the characters in there are all mothers. And the stories show them as really struggling to bring up their children due to the sort of advances of global warming, and where they live in Florida, a lot of hurricanes and things like that. So I'm going to read a quick abstract from the story here. Sorry, extract. The storm came and I raised the quiet. Well, the older sister thought, an island is never really quiet. What the storm had raised was a silence from the other cabin. For hours there had been no laughing, no bottle caps falling, none of the bickering that the girls had grown used to over the past 2 days. This was because there were no more adults. They had been left alone on the island, the two little girls, 4 and 7. Pretty little things, strangers called them. What dolls, their faces were exactly like their mothers. So these two girls in the story are left on an island by themselves. The mothers abandoned them because there's a big storm and they've got nowhere else left to live, and she decides it's just too much and she doesn't want to be responsible for them. I've got links for these stories as well. I can send them on to people if they like to read them. But I think what's really interesting in this story is that the girls left to fend for themselves. They end up wearing their mother's makeup and using her things to try and feel close to her. It's pretty clear that she's abandoned them. There's a section where it says she's been drinking. She's left them to go off with a man. But the interesting thing is that in the story, it shows the reasons that have led to this and the sort of difficult situation that the mother has had to deal with. And it shows a lot of empathy. So yeah, just that's what I wanted to really talk about. So this interweaving between disruption in the natural environment and the domestic sphere. So yeah, thank you.